Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Bright Blue Ludgate Lecture. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we are an independent think tank that seeks to defend and improve liberal society. We've been going 10 years now, and we've had a lot of impact on government policy and public attitudes across our four main areas: social policy, employment policy, education policy, and environment policy. And these Ludgate lectures, which we host once a month, are really to host prominent thinkers and decision makers to inform us, to challenge us, to inspire us. And I'm delighted today to have Professor Javed Khan with us. Javed was appointed by the then Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, to do a review on smoking and how we can further reduce the number of smokers that we have in society. And that review led to some policy suggestions which both the Conservative and now the Labour government have decided to take forward, including a generational smoking ban. And obviously Labour, the new Labour government, have also talked about increasing the smoking ban in indoor places to enclosed outdoor areas as well. And there's a consultation going on at the moment on that. Now, in terms of Javed himself, he's a leading figure in the UK public and voluntary sectors, having been the chief executive of Bernardo's charity, and then did the government independent review into tobacco control entitled Making Smoking Obsolete. So today's title is A Smoke-Free Future. How do we get there? What are the policies that we need to further drive down the number of people smoking? And the number of people smoking has decreased quite substantially in recent decades, but it now hovers just over 10% and has stayed stubbornly at that for some time. And of course, we have also seen in the last decade or so an increase in vaping, which is less harmful than smoking, but still has harms. So very interested in Professor Khan's views on these matters. What's going to happen is he'll speak for 20 minutes, then I'll question him for 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to you, the audience, for your questions as well. So please do ask your questions through Slido, which is just below the YouTube video that you're watching now. You can tell us through that Slido link who you are and what your question is, and then I will ask Javed through the messages that I get your questions. So please do that. And just to say as well, we are tweeting this, or Xing, if that's the right term. So if you want to tweet about this event, please do. We're using the hashtag #BrightBlue. So if I may, over to you, Javed.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, for that introduction. And thank you to Bright Blue for setting up this session. Good afternoon to everyone that's watching and listening. I'm really pleased to be here today to discuss a subject that I have no doubt has to be a key contributor to the future public health of our society. And as I'm hoping we all already know, smoking continues to be one of the most dangerous threats to public health, affecting millions of lives here in the UK and across the world. I am making the case that addressing this challenge with conviction will save lives and save money. It will ease the pressure on our crisis-ridden healthcare system and ultimately will help create a healthier, more prosperous society for future generations. Today, I will recap on some of the findings from my June 22 report that Ryan was referencing, Making Smoking Obsolete, including the role that vaping plays in this journey and the necessity of regulating its sale to prevent nicotine addiction. I'll also touch on the range of support for legislative change from the public and across political parties, which of course is vital for driving any kind of change of this nature. And I'll address the criticism often labelled at these kinds of public health measures that they represent nanny state politics. But firstly, before we dive into that, before we talk about solutions, we must acknowledge the scale of the problem that we are still living with. Smoking remains one of the leading preventable causes of death and disease in our country, It is responsible for nearly 80,000 deaths every year, with many more suffering from debilitating smoking-related diseases, including cancer, heart disease, respiratory conditions. And if we do nothing different, by 2030, we will have seen at least another 500,000 people die from smoking. And amongst the 6 million smokers, we know that it is the least educated, the least skilled, and the unemployed who suffer the most from smoking and its effects. So amongst the unemployed, for example, 1 in 4 people smoke, 25% rather than the average, which is 10%. And differences in smoking rates account for half the gap in life expectancy between the richest and the poorest in society. And of all the socioeconomic measures, housing tenure is the strongest predictor of smoking in England. Smoking prevalence in social housing is 3 times more than for those living in their own home. And the geographical prevalence of smoking is highest amongst our poorest places, where those who can least afford it are spending the most on smoking, which is driving them and their children into poverty. For example, rates of smoking in places like Burnley are 4.5 times higher than in somewhere like Exeter. So the human cost is staggering, but the broader financial cost is equally significant, placing immense strain on the NHS and on productivity. In 2022, I estimated that the overall cost to society was about £17 billion a year. But the latest estimates earlier this year from Landman Economics and the charity ASH put that figure at £22 billion a year, a rise of 25% in just the 2 years since my report came out. Over 2.5 billion of that is a cost to the NHS, and the rest to lost productivity and other indirect costs, such as the treatment of long-term conditions caused by smoking. That cost of £22 billion a year dwarfs the annual tax contribution of tobacco sales, which is £9 billion. Now, at an individual level, we also know smoking is a financially draining addiction. The average smoker spends about £2,000 a year on tobacco products. The financial impact of smoking is much higher for those who smoke and live in social housing, accounting for a greater share of their income. It's about 12% compared to the 7% for those who live in their own home. Now, I estimated that making smoking obsolete will restore about £11 billion into household budgets across the country. And this will lift about 2.6 million adults and over 1 million children out of poverty. So really, there can be no doubt that preventing smoking will save lives and save money. In 2022, I asked the government to be bold and brave. I said we needed to do much more to protect future generations from this highly addictive and deadly product. We needed to see a cultural shift to the point where no one would want to buy a cigarette anymore. So I presented 15 recommendations setting out a holistic response to the challenge. And taken together, they represented a comprehensive tobacco control approach. I called for an additional £125 million a year ring-fenced for smoking cessation services and public health campaigns. Research shows that properly funded stop smoking services can be highly effective in helping people quit smoking, particularly in disadvantaged communities where, as I said, smoking rates are the highest. The national mass media campaigns that I recommended would put stop smoking messages back on television, radio, and on social media, making the best use of Facebook, TikTok, Insta, and all of that, because it works. They would also help dismantle many of the myths about smoking and vaping. Now, to fund the new £125 million investment that I asked for, if budgets are stretched, and of course they are, I suggested the government should think about introducing a polluter pays levy. Whilst public services like the NHS are in crisis, the tobacco industry actually makes about £1 billion a year of profit in this country alone, off the back of our most disadvantaged communities. So I asked why the tobacco manufacturers shouldn't pay for the harms that they create. And that's also the recommendation of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Smoking and Health. Now, one of the more spirited recommendations in my report was to raise the legal smoking age by 1 year every year. This would eventually mean that those born after a certain date would never be able to legally purchase tobacco. It's a bold intervention, but it really would help prevent a new generation from becoming addicted to nicotine. Now, the latest data from ASH shows that 69% of British adults support this move, with 74% of Labour supporters, 75% of Lib Dems, and 70% of Tories supporting it too. So it has great support. In my recommendations, I also said it was critical that vaping should be actively promoted as a quit smoking tool for adults, alongside more detailed action to stop vaping from becoming a cool thing for young people to do. I also asked for an accelerated path to prescribed vapes for adult smokers, and the introduction of swap to stop initiatives making vapes readily available to current smokers, particularly in disadvantaged communities, helping them to quit. Importantly, I didn't position vaping as a silver bullet, but did conclude that e-cigarettes are clearly safer and therefore far less damaging to health than traditional cigarettes. All the data supports that. Alongside this, I asked for a major clampdown on the general marketing and sales of vapes, with a particular focus on restricting availability to children and banning current child-friendly packaging and descriptions that are widely used. And just as importantly, I also asked for an improved focus on prevention in the National Health Service. To put it bluntly, almost no progress will be made by the NHS in fighting lung cancer if we don't stop people smoking. The previous NHS long-term plan included a number of initiatives and commitments that I welcomed on smoking cessation. We now await a new 10-year plan in 2025 from the Labour government. It is good to hear that the new Secretary of State for Health, Wes Streeting, repeatedly mentioning the need to invest in prevention services. So I really look forward to seeing that translate into the plan next year. However, a word of caution. The Sunak government had already announced many of the additional multi-year investments into stop smoking services that I had argued for. And we will now need to watch with some care that those commitments don't disappear or get diluted in any revision from the new government. In my report, I also made the case that people trust their healthcare professionals. They listen to their advice. So I asked the government to commit to ensure through the NHS that every interaction that a smoker has with a health professional leads to initial advice on stopping smoking, and this practice to be embedded in training and delivery across all aspects of primary care. So, for example, our GP services, dentists, optometrists, pharmacists, nurses, midwives, and so on. It should not only be those who go into hospital for treatment who get offered the support. We need to reach them earlier. Now, some of that work, I'm pleased to say, has begun, but it must not get derailed. I also advocated for creating more smoke-free public spaces, making smoking less visible and less socially acceptable, which is crucial if we are to prevent future generations from taking up the habit. I'll return to that in a moment. My remaining recommendations were a substantial rise in tobacco duties, introducing tobacco licensing for retailers, banning online sales for all tobacco products, stopping supermarkets from selling tobacco, strengthening local enforcement services, changing the look of cigarettes, limiting the portrayals of smoking in the media, supporting those with mental health conditions by making stop smoking support part of their treatment, having a stop smoking midwife in every maternity department, providing incentives for pregnant women to stop smoking, ensuring regional and local prioritization of stop smoking with annual reports on progress, local councils to make a significant proportion of new social housing tenancies and the developments smoke-free. Now, all of that put together presented a holistic response to the challenge of creating a smoke-free future. As I said earlier, this was not an option of a pick and mix, but an opportunity to commit to a comprehensive strategic response, which will save money and save lives. Now, we should note that over the years, we've seen successive governments make great strides in reducing smoking rates through legislation. The Labour government and its ban on smoking in indoor public spaces in 2007 was groundbreaking in every sense, creating healthy environments for us all. In fact, today's young people would find it unimaginable and hard to understand how anybody could have ever smoked inside a restaurant or on a bus or any other public indoor place. Fast forward to today then, and I'm pleased to see that there is growing recognition across the political spectrum that we must take further decisive action to tackle smoking. We now have cross-party support for stricter legislation, so this is no longer a partisan issue. It's clear to MPs from all sides, with a few exceptions, that smoking-related deaths and illnesses don't discriminate by political affiliation, and the public health consequences demand united action. In their deliberations, our parliamentarians will, of course, be very aware of the range of public support for the interventions I've set out. I was pleased that the Sunak government set out its intentions to adopt most of my recommendations in its planned legislation, but then, of course, the general election came along. Now the new Labour government has also committed to introduce tobacco control legislation, but I'm actually pleased to hear it's planning to go further than the last attempt. For instance, as we've said, you will have heard that Labour is considering banning smoking in more public spaces, including outdoor areas where people gather, parks, beaches, hospital grounds, and outdoor eating places. Now, I clearly endorse this, though I do think public support for such a ban should be further tested through a formal consultation. Legislation can encourage healthier behaviours, but only if it is popular, not through heavy-handed enforcement. Encouragingly, a recent YouGov poll has shown that 51% of the public would support a ban on smoking in places like pub gardens, and 76% would support a ban outside hospitals. I think this support will be even higher once formal consultation begins, because that's what's happened in the past. Now, there are three major reasons why I endorse this move: health protection, social responsibility, and environmental impact. First, the health risks of secondhand smoke are clear and well documented. There can be no doubt about that. There is no safe level of exposure to tobacco smoke, and even brief exposure can cause harm. Banning smoking in outdoor public spaces protects non-smokers, especially children and vulnerable people, from the dangerous toxins in secondhand smoke. Second, visibility matters. When smoking is seen as normal activity in public spaces, it sends a message to young people that smoking is acceptable. If we're serious about reducing smoking uptake among today's young people, tomorrow's adults, we must remove it from public life. The 2007 indoor smoking ban has already proven effective in changing social attitudes, and it's time to extend these protections outdoors. Finally, there's the environmental impact. Cigarette butts are the most commonly littered item in the world. They take years to degrade and often end up in our waterways and oceans, causing grave damage to wildlife and ecosystems. A ban would reduce this harmful litter, contributing to a cleaner, healthier environment. I know the hospitality industry have raised alarm bells about the impact a public spaces ban will have on their businesses. In response, if we look at the impact of the 2007 ban on indoor public spaces, which was a much more radical intervention actually, it didn't have a major impact on hospitality businesses. And we saw a 98% compliance rate within just the first year. In fact, the number of premises with licenses to sell alcohol actually rose after the ban came in. And people visited pubs more often, not less, after that ban. Note too that smoking rates have reduced. They've halved since then. So smokers now actually make up a much smaller proportion of pub customers anyway. Now, I'd like to address a criticism I often hear when it comes to public health measures like smoking bans, and that's the claim that this is nanny state politics. The public are often led to believe that smoking is a personal choice, when really this is an addiction promoted by an industry that has no concern. I understand the concerns about government intervention in individual choices. I believe this criticism misses the larger point. Public health policies like this aren't about intruding on personal freedom. They're about protecting the public and creating environments where making healthier choices is easier for everyone. We know the tobacco industry works extremely hard to addict people at a very young age. And after that addiction kicks in, they really have no choice. Add to this that 2/3 of those who try smoking will go on to be addicted to daily smoking. So the only choice they really have is to whether they should try that first cigarette in the first place. Colleagues, tobacco is a uniquely dangerous and addictive product. In fact, the dangers are so clear that if cigarettes were invented today, they would never be legalized. So we are not talking about personal choice or freedom here. A key role of government is to safeguard the well-being of its citizens, particularly when an action doesn't just affect the individual, but has wider implications for society. Smoking is a prime example. It harms not only smokers, but also those around them. And we know it places an enormous burden on health services. Let's note too that we already accept and in fact celebrate many other forms of government intervention that protects public health. Seatbelt laws, for example, bans on drink driving, food safety regulations. These are all examples of what could also be termed nanny state policies. Yet they're overwhelmingly supported because they save lives and reduce harm. The same reasoning applies to smoking. The evidence is indisputable. In light of this, the government has a duty to act. Now, these measures aren't about controlling people's lives, they're about responsible governance. So in summary, the case for a smoke-free future, I believe, is highly compelling. Yes, the tobacco industry brings in tax revenue, but the cost to society far outweigh these gains. We have to stop viewing tobacco through the lens of economics and instead focus on the human and social costs of smoking. Achieving a smoke-free future is not only possible, it's really within our reach. My 2022 report outlined a clear roadmap for getting there, and I'm encouraged by the subsequent cross-party support for the necessary legislative changes. We have the tools, we have the knowledge, and we have the political will to create a smoke-free future. I am sure history will show that it was the right thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Javed. That was great. You were incredibly factful and very passionate, clearly very passionate and very informed about the subject. And it was good to have a kind of thorough overview of the kind of reasoning behind the policies that you proposed, which have now been mostly adopted by successive governments. Lots of questions are coming in, which is great. But before we go on to those questions, I'm going to ask a few. So the first is just making smoking obsolete. What do you mean by that? Is there a kind of proportion of the adult population? I presume it's not 0%, but maybe it is. What's the kind of target in your mind to have a kind of smoke-free future, and by when? Did you put that in your report?
Yeah, so when I was asked to conduct this review, the specifics of the ask were to review the then tobacco control policies that the government had in place, which had a target of reducing smoking to an average of 5% across the country by 2030. So that was the then ambition. And I looked at that in great detail, reviewed all of the available evidence, etc., spoke to experts across the world, literally, I think about 12 different countries and across the nations in the UK. And it was my considered opinion that previous ambition, firstly, wouldn't be met unless radical change took place. It would be delayed by at least 7 years in the very best places, and probably 15 to 20 years in the most place with the most prevalence of smoking. But more importantly, I felt that ambition wasn't ambitious enough. That if we were really serious about saving lives, then why go for an average of 5%? And it is an average, so you can imagine the variation that would have left across the country. That actually 0% is what we should be committing to. If we accept the evidence that this is a hugely addictive and life-threatening addiction, that small tinkering actions here and there, why should we accept them? Why shouldn't we go and really commit ourselves to making delivering a smoke-free future? So in our report, I set out the details of what that would mean in practice if these recommendations were adopted. And we estimated that, and that was in 2022, that by 2040, we would reach a 0% smoking kind of prevalence in this country. So it would take time. It wouldn't get there overnight, and hence the the year-by-year restrictions, and all of the other as a package. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the year-by-year, and politicians are supporting it and so on. But I did present it as a holistic package. So you've got to think about it in the round. You put all of that in place, and by 2040, you would get to 0%.
Great. Okay, that's great to hear. I'm very clear. In terms of you talked about consulting with lots of different countries. Which country stood out for you as being really advanced on this? I have heard, and you are much more than an expert than I am, Sweden has got a very low smoking rate. And I'd be interested to know if that's the case and why, or if there's other countries that stand out and why you think it is that they stand out and do so well.
Yeah, Sweden stands out for some things. I mean, there are other countries for other measures. So, it was quite varied. Every country had something to offer, and every country had different challenges that they were facing. So Sweden, for example, I mean, their smoking of cigarette rates is relatively low, but their smoking of tobacco in the gums is far higher than it would be here. Yeah, and so they've got an alternative problem that they're trying to solve there. If you look at New Zealand were ahead of us in trying to introduce the year-by-year ban on the age of sale. Unfortunately, that's got derailed a little bit with the changes in politics there. So, it was their idea that I picked up and then tried to extrapolate and think that we could be the first major Western country that could adopt something so radical. There are places in America that are doing some really interesting things around vaping. But as you know, it's a federated model there, so each state is different in the way that they approach things. I can think of Australia was really trying to think through some of the more radical options as well, but they had particular problems in terms of the diversity agenda in Australia. In terms of the Aborigine community, had very, very high rates of smoking, far higher, I think about 5 times higher than the white Australian population, and they were making no inroads into that. So they were trying to think about how the diversity challenges of population statistics and so on, and the behaviors of various communities, how you could incentivize. So they've got a different challenge there. So each country had something to offer, and each country had its individual kinds of local problems. There was no one place that I could suggest was the benchmark that we had to follow. In fact, what was most pleasing was that over the years, and I'm talking decades now, most of the world looked at Great Britain, looked at the United Kingdom as the leader in terms of innovative solutions to tackling smoking. And the 2007 ban was a really good example of that. However, what was very clear that we had lost our way. We'd lost that lead position in trying to be at the cutting edge. And this report, part of the agenda, was trying to put us back in that leading light, as we rightly should be, and as we have been over the decades, trying to do what others will want to follow. And already, there are reports of other countries. As soon as that report was out and the legislative agendas that the Sunak government put in place, other countries were saying, we're watching it with great care and saying, this is something that we really need to watch and imitate.
Great. I mean, it's interesting in terms of the success of the current public policy architecture, the smoking ban in indoor places back in the noughties, plain packaging, and obviously some of the public health messaging as well, particularly since the 80s and the 90s, is obviously led to quite a substantial decline. But what is interesting is, really what you're suggesting now is that we creep more towards prohibition with the generational smoking ban and widening the number of smoke-free places. And it's interesting because that seems to me that you're trying to make smoking policy more like the policy of other recreational drugs, which are banned. And, some people say, actually, what we should be doing is making the policies for recreational drugs, like cannabis, for example, more like the public policy architecture for smoking, like it should be decriminalized but heavily regulated. So it strikes me as quite interesting that smoking's going in that direction, more towards prohibition, when actually for other, nicotine is obviously a drug. For other recreational drugs, we're going in a different direction. I don't know whether you sort of thought about that, because I think it's an interesting
Yeah, not an easy one to answer because we didn't spend any detailed time in researching the facts, the details, and other countries' approaches to those other recreational drugs, as you say. So we don't comment on them in the report for that reason because we didn't capture the evidence. But it's an interesting kind of point of view and a debate to have. But I would still come back to the facts that we know about cigarettes. Right, this is a deadly product. It's the only From my research, it's the only product out there that is sold legally that, if used as prescribed, can kill you. Right? Even alcohol doesn't fit into that bracket. If used as prescribed, it can kill you. And 2/3 of the people who will smoke that cigarette are likely to die as a result of it, either directly or indirectly, from a whole range of illnesses. There is no other product that is legal on the market like that. And as I said earlier, if they were introduced today, invented today, there is no way that the legislation will be passed to make them legal. Right? They'd never get past all of the nice kind of assessments and all the other kind of licensing processes that the new products have to go through. So this is a unique product that has to be treated differently from everything else. The message of the report, the overarching message of the report, was to government that if you do this, what you will succeed in doing is making this a country where nobody will ever be able to buy a cigarette again. And also, just as importantly, make it a country that is highly unattractive to the tobacco industry to come and ply its trade. That's got to be the journey that we're committing to. And what effect that has on other recreational drugs and so on, I can't, as I say, I can't really comment on without having looking at the evidence that's behind it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the only legal product which can kill you. Interesting. And also what you said in your speech about housing tenure being the biggest predictor of smoking and social housing being the standout here. That was really interesting. I think a thing that people on the centre.
So just on that, Ryan, if I mean to say social housing, there are states in America that have completely non-smoking social housing tenures. Right? You cannot live in social housing if you smoke in some of those places. Now, I didn't present that as the model. So I talked about, all new social housing tenancies and new developments could target, say 70% non-smoking. And I say that 70% because 30% of social housing people at the moment smoke, 70% don't. So enforce it in that way.
That rule in the States is that you can't smoke either inside or in the estate, inside your own home.
Yeah, they are smoke-free zones.
Yeah.
So people take it much further than what I was proposing.
Yeah, interesting. I suppose people on the centre right will say, this is all a bit killjoy. It's sort of stopping people from having fun, having a fag outside a pub. Do you worry about that? It's sort of, particularly for younger people, it's sounding like, yes, these are risky things, but, if people want to have fun sometimes, then you should let them. And, if pubs and clubs are going to, reduce as a result of this, then, there's a danger of being kind of anti-fun with it. Do you agree? I mean, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but do you?
Yeah. No, I completely disagree with that, you see, because for a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, smoking is an addiction. It's not there is no choice involved. Once you're addicted, you're addicted. And the industry works really hard to addict you. So it's not about choice then. You have to have that puff or, you can't get through the day. And so people who are addicted need help, just like any other addiction. So it's not about fun anymore. They don't have any choice. And secondly, the activity that they are pursuing actually affects other people as well. It's not a private thing. It affects other people just because of the secondary smoke, which is well documented now, does have effect. So for those reasons, it's not killjoy, it's actually stopping killing. That's much more of an appropriate kind of way of summarizing it.
Okay. And what I found really interesting, and you talked about in your report, 125 million to public cessation, smoking, kind of messaging. One thing, the behavioral insights team, I remember a study that they did, I think it was in Glasgow, where they took a group of young women and gave a financial incentive if they stopped smoking. But the study afterwards said it wasn't actually so much the financial incentive. It was the excuse to say to other people, I'm not smoking now because I get this financial incentive. So I found that really fascinating, that actually it wasn't necessarily financial incentive, it was just the kind of ability to break free
Yeah,
from the peer pressure and the social norm.
yeah, yeah,
And I just wondered how much you've gone into thinking about those behavioral things
yeah,
in your study. So there's obviously, one lever you have to pull or can pull is the banning in certain areas and the generational ban. But in
yeah.
terms of kind of changing social norms, had you gone into that a little bit more?
Yeah, yes, we did, and spent some time with the behavioral insights team in government, and the nudge theory type of, which is what you're talking about, really. And we took a lot of account of that, and some of that thinking is built in to those recommendations, right? That's the logic behind it of how you get, as you say, behavioral change as opposed to enforcement. I mean, some enforcement's required, of course, but I strongly believe that this is about a cultural shift in a country that we're trying to drive, where smoking no longer becomes the norm, and actually in the way that is no longer the norm when you get on a bus or sit in a restaurant, right? You just don't, nobody would smoke anymore, and anybody that tried it, everyone else will be upset by it and do something about it. That is an enormous cultural shift that's taken place. This is what I'm talking about, is an extension of that. A practical example, another one I can give you to the Glasgow one, is that I recommended financial incentives for pregnant women to stop smoking. That's based on detailed pilot studies that have taken place in our country that have shown that if you give, and I'm talking not large amounts of financial incentives, but vouchers for certain things. And at the start of a pregnancy, and the woman is a smoker, and in order to continue to getting them, they need to regularly have carbon monoxide testing, which will show that they are actually not smoking at the time. And that had an enormous impact on reducing the number of mothers who smoked. And the benefits of that were to them themselves, and of course to their unborn child and their born child, and all of the illnesses that are prevented as a result. Now, what those studies showed was that it didn't just have an effect on the mother, but it had a large effect on the partner and other people that they lived with. Yeah, so an indirect impact of saying, well, actually, I know this is no longer good for me or our child, so you should stop. So for every pound, I think the calculation was for every pound that was invested in the incentive scheme, there was a study that showed that the benefit was 4 times as high in terms of reducing the smoker, reducing their illnesses during pregnancy, and reducing the risk of complications at birth. So yeah, we took account of a lot of that, and I'm pleased to say the Sunak government had already introduced the incentive scheme for pregnant mothers, which is great. I just hope all of that is going to survive in the next version of the legislation, and I hope the budget on the 30th of October doesn't wield a knife that reduces those kind of commitments.
Very interesting. I suppose a final question from me is, the proportion of people who are now smoking, as it has dropped quite, it has dropped in the last few decades quite considerably. Presumably those people are the most addicted people, the people who are still left smoking. And I wonder, again, with the parallels with, say, recreational drugs, which said, people who argue for decriminalization say, surely it is better to treat the addiction that some people have to certain drugs as a public health rather than a criminal thing. And isn't it better for people to access, people who are very vulnerable and addicted, to access these drugs through organizations or corporations which are heavily taxed and regulated and held to account rather than through criminal sources? And some people do say, if we go towards prohibition of smoking, maybe the black market criminals will be more in charge of the distribution to these very vulnerable people rather than corporations who are held to account very strongly.
Yeah.
Interested in your.
So on the illegal market that you refer to, I mean, there is always that risk, of course. And we looked at this in some detail and tried to find evidence of where that has happened in the past. And actually, we couldn't find it. There's always the risk is cited, but it doesn't actually follow through. So that's one thing. But second thing is that in order to prevent that, stronger enforcement is going to be required in terms of the illegal market. And that's why some of the money that I asked for, I wanted directed to strengthening local enforcement. because it's very poor and weak at the moment. And if you add to things like to that licensing arrangements, at the moment you can sell tobacco without a license. So we want to introduce licensing to regulate, where and how often cigarettes are smoked. But more generally, in terms of the smokers, and this is often a misunderstanding of these proposals, this is not about criminalizing the smoker because they are addicted, right? For whatever reason, however it started, they are addicted. They need help. And the vast majority of smokers, all the research shows this, vast majority of smokers actually want to stop smoking, but they just can't do it on their own because they try and they try and they try again and they fail. That's where stop smoking cessation services come in at a local level. That's where primary health care comes in, the initial advice, the signposting, that will help them. But this isn't about criminalizing them. It will criminalize those who sell to people who are underage, quite rightly. And I spent some time with the tobacco industry, the Retailers Association. They were all asking for these licenses to be introduced. People might be surprised by that. They actually wanted it because they want to get rid of the rogue traders. They want to be regulated because most of them want to do it properly. And so they said, we'd be really pleased if you introduced some kind of licensing scheme as one of your proposals. So actually, the vast majority of people, whether it's the smokers or whether it's those who are selling the cigarettes to them, want to do this properly. So I don't think we should be swayed by any of the scaremongering around this is going to create an enormous black market. And so there is no evidence of that. It's never happened before. I don't think it's going to happen now. But enforcement is going to be required.
Okay, thanks, Javed. Very interesting, and you're definitely on top of all the evidence. Let's bring in some questions from the floor. So I'll start with Tim, who says, are you concerned that the generational smoking ban will fuel a black market in tobacco that could undermine the policy's effectiveness? You've kind of just answered that. Yeah. So unless there's anything else, we'll move to the next one. James says there's a growing shift towards destigmatizing legalizing cannabis. How do you feel about this? Again, that's
I think we've answered that one too.
Saying, but if you had any reflections on that. Okay, I've got one here from Joe who says, you have stressed the role of nicotine alternatives such as vaping as part of your solution, as well as some of the potential drawbacks. Could you please go into more detail about how the government should mitigate the danger they pose as a gateway into nicotine addiction for children and young people?
So, this is a really hot topic. So I'm glad you asked the question, Joe. And I skimmed over it earlier, but there's a lot more detail in the report, particularly around vaping and the increase in vaping amongst children and vapes. The reason vapes are safer than cigarettes is they don't have any of the tar that is included in a cigarette. And it's the tar when you light up a cigarette. It's not the nicotine that kills you. Nicotine addicts you, but it's the tar that can create over 1,000 different illnesses in your body. So the vapes are partly safer because there's no tar in there, but the nicotine is there, and the nicotine still addicts. And that's a double-edged sword, because on the positive side, that's why vapes are a good quit tool for those who are addicted to smoking, because they still get their nicotine that they need in order to cope, but they don't get any of the tar. But the problem is those who have never smoked cigarettes and pick up a vape for the first time will also get addicted because of the nicotine that's included. And we don't want that. So I was very clear to government that they need to promote vapes as a quit tool, not a cool tool for young people to pick up because it's the latest fad. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. Now, there are many reasons for that, because at the moment, as far as I know, there is no legislation that stops a vaping company from giving away vapes to underage children. They can't be sold to under 18s legally, but they can be given away for free. It's outrageous, really. You can't give cigarettes to underage kids, but you can give vapes. So the new legislation would tighten that up. It would stop that from happening. Second thing is, you go into any vape shop and you see the range of flavors and the marketing that's on the counters. There's stuff clearly for the adults, but there is stuff clearly for children. You get dinosaur packaging, for example, on vapes. What's that about, right? That's for young kids. I've got a grandson who's 4 years old who's fixated with dinosaurs. I wouldn't want him to vape, but if he saw the packaging, he might want to grab hold of one of those. That's outrageous. And then the flavors of the vapes. You got gummy bear flavor. I can't think of any adults that would probably go for that, or bubblegum flavor or something like that. This is clearly an industry that is targeting young people to get them addicted to vaping through the nicotine. That's the problem that we face. So they won't kill you like cigarettes will, but they will addict you. So we've got to stop that. We've got to clamp down on all of that marketing and packaging that is clearly directed to young children. I mean, I spoke to head teachers during the review, we're pulling their hair out and saying they knew the kids in their class, secondary schools largely, had vapes on them, right? But you can't smell. So, they go into the toilets and they smoke. So there's a different kind of addiction going on there, and a kind of a market within the playground of selling these. Now, where were they getting the vapes from in the first place? So something is very wrong in the whole ecosystem of the trade that is legally or usually unlegally available to the children. And we've got to clamp down on all. And that's where what the report as a whole, as a holistic response, attempts to tackle. But my message again to government then and still now is, if they try and pick and mix this and do the bits that perhaps are more palatable or cheaper to do, then the whole overarching strategy, I don't think, will deliver, because it will create other problems, and they've got to look at it as a holistic response.
Great, thank you. Victoria has asked, while age cutoffs are common, e.g. for driver's licenses, it's unusual to differentiate rights based on year of birth. Are there any other examples of this?
I'm not sure there are any examples in this country, but given the idea was first framed in New Zealand, we spent quite a bit of time thinking this through about the enforcement of it. And I go back to my earlier answer about cultural change. That is what we are aiming to introduce here, a cultural shift where nobody actually wants to buy a cigarette anymore. It is no longer acceptable in society, indoor or outdoor, to smoke. And therefore, there won't be the challenge in years to come. To start with, I expect there will be. There will be issues, and teething problems and so on, right? But they are usually in any kind of, even if it's not a graduated kind of change, any immediate change. When we raised the age of smoking from 16 to 18, it was just one jump, but it caused problems to start with. And the same issues were raised there about, well, 18-year-olds are going to have to present their ID. What if you're 17 years and 10 months? You won't get a cigarette. But if you're 18, and so on. All those issues are being discussed again. So they're nothing new. It's just a different approach, which I'm pretty confident, when you look at the history of this country, of how it's managed to introduce restrictions in a whole range of ways, it can be done. There'll be teething problems. Of course there will be. But over a period of time, when you think about 10, 15, 20, 25 years, which is how this vision has got to be set, there will be an enormous cultural shift, and we won't be worrying about these early teething problems any longer.
Great, thanks, Javed. An anonymous person, could be Wes Streeting. Hopefully it's Wes. Yeah. Says, big fan, Professor Javed. I think a huge issue we face is the already existing black market of tobacco. What can we do to stop the smuggling of tobacco into the UK?
Some of the recommendations I didn't mention, because they're in a finer detail, for example, was border control. And I mean, I went as far as saying, actually, cigarettes should be not allowed through duty-free anymore, right? For anybody. We should just stop it at the borders. We don't want cigarettes sold here, and we don't want them imported from anywhere else either, because often the black market is supported through that. That's some of the evidence that we saw. So there are restrictions that can be placed. I think the investing more money in local enforcement, and I say this because I know how dire it is at the moment. I went out on raids with enforcement officers in parts of the country to watch what they did and how they did it. And so at the moment, for example, when they knew there was black market cigarettes being sold under the counter, as it were, they went in, they confiscated, they locked the place up. But their enforcement rules at the moment meant that within 2 or 3 hours, that shop would be open again and would be running again and doing the same stuff over again. They'd get a little slap on the wrist, maybe a £500 fine or something like that, and they'd be operating. So this is an organized crime behind the scenes. In order to challenge that, you've got to invest in our local enforcement officers, right? They just don't have the tools or the resources at the moment. I would give them greater powers to put in place much larger fines that will really dent the business that they've just closed down. I'd say tens of thousands of pounds to make them think again about whether they want to do this. £500 is neither here nor there for them, because the money they make out of under-the-counter sales, far outweighs that. So, it's got to be a holistic response again, from border control, stopping that, duty-free, controlling what is brought in legally or illegally into the country, and then how it's sold and how enforcement officers have greater powers.
Great. Another anonymous person has asked, you said to change the look of cigarettes. How do we do that?
So it's quite simple, actually. The research that we saw was that if you change a cigarette color from white, which is what they all are at the moment, to either green or brown, it deters the smoker, you believe, right? Behavioral, maybe, or however you describe it. But that's what the research showed. That if you change the color to one of those two colors, less people will want to smoke that cigarette. It's a simple intervention.
Interesting. Another anonymous person says, what do you say in response to concerns from retailers that a generational ban will increase antisocial behavior and potentially violence?
I'd need to see the evidence, right? Where are they getting that from? Because any previous bans or restrictions have not led to either of those two events. So where's the evidence for that? I think there's a lot of scaremongering going on at the moment, but there isn't the evidence behind it.
Okay. Another anonymous person, is it time for a retail license for vaping? And have you spoken to the new government about the need for this?
So I do believe in a reviewed approach to licensing. And I'd go further. It's not just vaping, but it's cigarettes themselves as well. So I think we should limit the number of retailers who can sell cigarettes. In the report, I went further and said all supermarkets should be banned from selling cigarettes, because often that's where they're sold cheapest, because of the volumes. So some people were surprised by this, but if you go into Aldi or Lidl, who are outperforming all the other supermarkets, they've never sold cigarettes. Hasn't dented their profits. So we should do the same for the others. So licensing is really important, but also for vaping as well, as the anonymous person has mentioned. I would support that.
Okay. Jimmy has said, do you agree that the natural next step for generational health is to tax and restrict unhealthy foods? If so, what should this look like? So I realize this is going out of your domain. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Going beyond my knowledge level, I'm afraid. I didn't look at foods and so on, so I can't give you an informed answer to that.
But presumably you would say, if this works, and as you think it will, and is successful, that it could be a good model for other unhealthy products out there which have such a profound impact both on the individual and people around them.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. The only difference here between what we're talking about today and that is that they don't have a secondary impact directly on anybody else. So, it can lead to obesity and so on. Of course, families can suffer as a result of that, but the individual, their body will suffer. Health service will still have to expend money on them, etc., and all of that. But it doesn't have this, like the secondary smoking impact isn't there.
Okay. And then another anonymous person has said, you mentioned early on in your lecture that the fight against smoking is strongly linked to socioeconomic inequalities, with smoking rates remaining highest in deprived communities. Would you suggest any targeted interventions to reduce smoking in these communities?
Yes, absolutely. So a number of the interventions I suggested have to be targeted. So, for example, vaping and giving away swap to stop kits, where stops smoking cigarettes and here's vapes for you free of charge, and they'd be targeted at those places where smoking is highest and they are the most deprived parts of the country, including in social housing places. So yes, targeting very, very important, I think. I also talked about government investing more money in regional initiatives. So that, of course, should also need to be spread according to need in terms of prevalence of smoking, and the most deprived places would get the most of the resource in order to do that. And there's some good examples of that in the Northeast, for example, which has very high prevalence of smoking at the moment. The money that they have managed to pool together there, they've developed a strategy and interventions that have had significant effect because it was locally controlled and targeted to particular communities. So I'd be a strong supporter of that.
Great. And then I suppose a kind of final question from me was you were talking about smoking being addictive, which it clearly is, and I think it is. But is it the case that it's addictive for everybody? And I say that because I think of my own grandparents who stopped smoking at the age of 50 in the 1980s when the public health messaging was so profound about the impact on smoking. And they smoked quite frequently each day. And they literally stopped. I mean, so they said. I mean, I was only very young at this age, but they said they just stopped. And so I'm just questioning. Obviously, it is addictive to some people who are using it. I can see that. But is it addictive to everybody?
So look, I'm not a medic, so I can't give you a professional view on what an expert in medics would give you. As Professor Chris Whitty, for example, is the person to ask on something like that. So I can't say that to you, but I can say to you that as far as I know from the research I saw, smoking affects every smoker. It just affects them differently because the human body is complex.
Mm.
Some will have greater resilience to
Yeah,
particular addictive products, others will have less, and therefore it manifests itself in different ways. But it is pretty clear that the lifespan of a smoker is reduced as a result of their smoking. I can't imagine any medic disagreeing with that. And so that means that, somebody may die at the ripe old age of 85 and they say, oh, it did me no harm, but they could have lived to 95 for all we know. Right? So there is an impact on everybody. So I don't think we should get too involved in that kind of debate, really. We should focus on the damage that we know that smoking does, and particularly for government, who have, as I say, a duty to protect the public. Public health is their responsibility, and therefore they have a duty to act. If they choose not to, then the impact of their lack of conviction to this agenda, I think, will result in, as I say, 500,000 people dying between now and 2030, and many other millions dying beyond that if we don't act now.
great. Thank you, Javed. I think that's a good time to stop. And it's a very important, as you say, deadly issue. But it's also very live at the moment, and there's lots of debate going on, particularly in centre-right circles about how they approach the government's new proposals around the generational ban, but also expanding smoke-free areas. So this lecture, I think, will be incredibly informative, and I hope everybody watching has found it incredibly useful. Professor Khan came with a lot of very detailed facts and evidence, and I certainly learned a lot. So thank you very much for your time and your contribution. Just to say to everybody that we have a series of Ludgate lectures coming up over the autumn. So in October, we have Professor Paul Gregg, who is chairing the government's new economic inactivity task force, advising on how to bring down the number of people who are economically inactive. So that will be happening in October. In November, we have Amanda Spellman, who is the former Chief Inspector of Ofsted, to talk about how to raise standards in school. And then in December, we have Anthony Selden, who is going to talk about what makes a good Prime Minister. Obviously, he's written quite a number of books. So please do tune in for those upcoming lectures. Just a final thanks to Professor Khan for spending the afternoon with us and sharing his thoughts. We're very grateful. So a kind of virtual round of applause. You can't hear the audience, they are clapping. So
Many
thank you
thanks.
very much. And thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.